Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending. Now, this is quite a difficult topic to actually talk about because I think every single person has got their own viewpoint on how this is used, when it's used, and what it's good for and what it's not for. Basically, if your bibliometric measure, for example, your H factor says it's above 30, you're very happy with it. If it's above 10, you think it's not a good measure and there's 15 faults with it and this is why it's not working, all these sort of things. So yes, it's a controversial topic, but I would like to start stating what I feel. Without knowledge of what we measure, we do not gain much by judging someone using a single number. And I'm specifically talking about the H factor. I mean, it doesn't help to just compare person A and person B without knowing what are we measuring and what's the purpose of this measuring. Now, in an academic environment, the reality is we use H factors. It's no way, it's a worldwide trend. They use it even more in other countries than in South Africa, but it is there and it's there to stay. And I think the reason for it to stay in the foreseeable future is what's the alternative? Now, just quickly to inform everybody who's not familiar with what bibliometrics are or is, it's statistical analysis of the written publications such as books or articles, and it's a quantitative analysis, so it counts. And those counts are freely available on the internet. So it's open to the public eye. Everybody can look other scientists up. They do use, however, this tool, for example, to do budgetary spending. For example, the bibliometrics used in the library would typically be how many times do people use a certain journal? Is that journal worth buying every year, or should we rather buy something else? How many times do people cite that specific journal? And you can allocate your search in such a way that you can get that sort of info. You can evaluate the performance of different scientists or organizations, so you can compare, for example, how well does the Department of Botany and Zoology at Stellenbosch do relative to the Department of Botany and Zoology at Cape Town. You can explore the impact of certain research fields, like what's the difference between whether you're a taxonomist, where you describe species, versus the impact of cancer research. How many times do people cite cancer research? How many times do they cite work done in the description of species? So it's got all these comparable ways to actually look at things. The H index is most frequently used at the academic level in the academic departments. It was described in 2005 by J. Hirsch for the H. And it's an author level metric, and it attempts to explain both the productivity and the citation impacts of the publications of a scientist or scholar. Now, here's an example of an H index of a particular person. And we can see a lot from this. This is from Scopus, one of the search engines. This scientist has published just over 90 papers in his lifetime from 1996. And this is the cumulative number of times those papers have been cited throughout the entire period. Now, the H factor of 30 would mean that this person has got 30 papers that's been cited at least 30 times or more. So even if you have another 20 papers that's been cited 30 times, you'll have 50 papers that's been cited 30 times, your H factor is 30. Okay, it stays there. So you need to have more citations. You can see there's a gradual increase. So new work are also getting cited. And then there's a few papers that's been cited a lot, close to 100 times. And this is the perfect line, what you would expect. Every paper that gets cited, or every paper published gets cited every year, and it adds on. So you have the straight line. So you can look at this and you can see, yes, this person is fairly productive. There's a continuous publication record, and there's also a few highly cited papers of this person. And you can now compare these profiles among different scientists. However, it's important to know that there are various different forms of this H factor. Can come from different search engines, for example, ISI Web of Science. Now this is the one everybody hates the most. This is the same person that I just showed you. The H factor range between 27 to 33. So when you do a job interview, you would say, my H factor is 33. And Joe Soap next to you has got an H factor of 27, but actually it's exactly the same person, but it's dependent on which search engine you use. So that's already, you need to know what you're using. You can't use everything. These search engines give you, and the reason for these differences are mainly because they use different databases to actually search. For example, Google Scholar would include your PhD thesis if you're a scientist, and how many times your PhD thesis have been cited, book chapters, where the ISI Web of Science don't include those things. Conference proceedings are excluded at the ISI Web of Science. So then you can also look to compare people, what was the total number of times this person has been cited, and then what's the average citations per item published. So is this person made up of one good paper and 99 never cited papers? Or is the average about 27? That's pretty all right, I would say. Or 20 times. And then you can also look at this I-10 index, which only takes how many papers of this scientist published. It's got more than 10 citations. So out of the 90 papers, 60. Is it productive in the last couple of years? Yes, 57. So it tells you basically the research profile of this scientist. It's very difficult to judge the quality of those papers from this. So that's a critical point that you always need to consider, and that's why I say you need logic and common sense often to actually interpret this. ISI Web of Science also gives you this sort of stats where you can look at how many papers that the person published every year. Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? Over time, couple of bad years, good years. And then importantly, how many times have been cited every year? Now it's obvious, the more you publish, the more paper in the public domain, therefore the more citations you accumulate every year. But you would expect this to increase constantly over time. And maybe when the person becomes more senior, there's kind of a plateau because also your very first papers stop getting cited. The technology is old, it's 20 years ago. It's kind of hidden in a fast evolving field. So this is a typical profile of, for example, a professor who published as a postdoc, grew his career, got more and more students, more and more papers, and eventually now starting to level off in the number of publications or citations each year. So you can read things off there. You can also look at who this person actually collaborates most with, what's the most frequently published stuff. So all of these bibliometric methods can give you an indication of what the person is and what they do and how they work. How is this used in the broader context? Well, I was quite interested to read that the UK government last year actually considered using the bibliometrics as a possible tool in the research excellence framework and to base their funding based on that. So what they would typically do in the South African context, we have these centers of excellence. So they would say, how well did this center do relative to that center? How many times are their work being cited versus non-cited for the other one? And then we should invest all our research here. There's very interesting stuff done in Canada recently where they specifically did that. They look at this number of citations these big groups get versus if you take the same money and you split it among 10 independent researchers, and they actually saw that the productivity and the quality was not linked at all to these big funding centers. So they actually said it's not great to have an omics lab where you invest billions and let the rest die. So it was a big argument being used that it's better to spread money. They looked at H factors and they looked at how many times the work's getting cited for that specific group. In our research environment, I do use stuff from our own environment where I do some of the managing, most of the managing. For example, we went through a departmental review recently and we used the number of papers of all my staff. Scopus makes it very easy. You can count all the staff. You look at the academic ranks. And the reason for doing this is you would expect your professors, who takes all the money every month, to produce the most, because they must bring in the money also to get the high salaries, and the more junior staff would publish fewer papers in the beginning of their career and they don't earn as much. So in a budgetary tool as well as a productivity tool, then immediately you can see here, oh, maybe something is wrong in terms of that person. Should we look at a promotion? Should we look at all the associate professors, those senior lecturers, H factors, working in the same field, it's botany and zoology, they're H factors, and the number of papers published, H factors in blue, sorry, number of papers published in yellow, you would see that maybe we should look at those staff for a promotion. And indeed, all three of these senior lecturers have been promoted this year. So it does work. In this instance, then it also highlights maybe a potential glitch in the system, what's happening here. But then you go and look at the person. What's this person doing? Oh, they're running huge contracts. They write a lot of scientific reports to industry. They don't use the conventional way of us always, if it's not published in a peer-reviewed journal, it's not science. Now that's not correct. Okay, so there's always reasons also to look at this and then apply common logic, knowledge, and then decide is this relevant or not. You can compare different institutions simply by the number of papers. Here we compare 3 different varsities with the same size of staff approximately, with also a similar research field. And what we saw here, which was very delighted for us, is Stellenbosch University published the most papers in 2014 with a gradual increase and is now the top publishing house. What does this mean, however? We publish a lot, but what's the quality? We can look at the number of papers published, what was the impact factor of journals, how many papers did we publish in journals with the impact factor higher than 5, higher than 4. You count that number and you compare it to the rest of the papers published. So it's quite a nice tool to just see what's the impact of our research. And indeed, because we publish in high impact journals, the H index for the Department of Botany and Zoology at Stellenbosch University is the highest among the 4 top universities countrywide for only papers published between 2008 and 2014. Because you want to link the year time, because it doesn't help to go back 50 years. That's not a reflection as the citations carry on. So this was a nice way to show that we are good, okay? And it's nice. It works for us. But I also think it's quite interesting to see that Cape Town published slightly more than what we did, but our impact was higher. Okay? So should you care about the H index? My answer is yes. We live in an environment where it's publish or perish. We live in an environment where we say it's a postdoc apocalyptic era. And what we say with this is we've got about, I think, 300 postdocs on our campus right now. It's people who work as PhDs, who are competing to find jobs, who are competing with academics, where there's no funding to actually provide permanent posts. So the competition is incredibly fierce. What funding agencies do, what universities do, if somebody applies at my department, I advertise for a community ecologist. They work in the same research field. They're both postdocs. How many times have their work being cited? How many single author papers do they have? I can compare them, and I use these metrics. If the measures are totally different, then you have to go and look for maybe reasons why. But generally, it is useful. So we compete, so you should care about the H factor. There are problems with the H factor now. There's a whole list here. I just quickly want to read through them. Scientists who spend time in industry don't necessarily have a large number of papers, which will reflect in a low H factor. Very influential papers are sometimes published. Somebody works for 20 years on this concept. They publish it. They win a Nobel Prize. They get cited 1 million times, but they've got one paper. Their H factor is 1. Okay? So that's it. So there are some people like this Claude E. Shannon, who is considered the godfather of the digital research. He's got an H index of 7. Okay, but he is very pronounced in the scientific field. Also, people with names that are not quite English and in the English alphabet, it's difficult to accurately determine, and I don't mean to be patronizing, but if your surname is you or you, there are millions. Okay, it's difficult, and I even struggle to find the Andersons in my department because you have to look carefully. And different fields have widely different authorship, publication, and citation patterns. You think of medical research, highly cited, things like species description. Only people working on that specific animal or plant will actually cite your work. Citations take time to accumulate, does not generally take into account the non-traditional scholarly output like software. We know, for example, the scientists on our campus who are working at computer science, they publish a lot in conference and the software, and they don't get H factors for that, so it doesn't add up. But you compete against similar people. This is a big problem. It does not take into account the number of authors. So always when I look at somebody's H factor, I would consider, okay, that example I've given earlier, this person has published 6 papers, it's got more than 100 citations. How many times have been first author, and what's the multitude of authors on those papers? That can give you the contribution of that person, the impact of that person. First author, you would assume that person needs to get a lot of the credit for that paper. Everywhere else in the middle, the senior author, of course, the corresponding senior author at the professor level, that's what you expect. So we can do some other factors, like the M factor. Now this is just a different way of the H factor, but what it does is it's a slope or the rate of increase in the H index over time, and I think it's probably an underestimated or underappreciated measure. To calculate the M value, you basically take the researcher's H index and divide by the number of years since their first publication. Therefore, if you compare a professor, 30 years of the first publication, the H factor will be divided by that. If you take a postdoc, they've only published for 4 years, but they've been cited the same number of times relative, their M factors will be exactly the same. So you can compare across those different people. So this gets rid of that, but it accumulates over time problem. This is Alex Bateman, which I found these statements on the internet to be quite similar to mine, so I copied quite a bit from what he said. The M value is the H index over years. If your M value is less than 1, you average. 1 to 2, you're above average. 2 to 3, it's excellent. More than 3, it's stellar. Then he points it, you should fly that postdoc from across the world and hire them immediately, because this person is going to become, based on the current, what we see, a very productive and well-cited person. So if you're interested in this, that's what you should do. Now, we play the game to increase the H factor, because it's an important measure. Here are some basic rules, how not to actually do it. You can self-cite. You'll remember on those first slides I didn't highlight it, but your H factor also includes the number of times you've cited yourself. So if you cite all your papers every time that you've published before, your H factor will increase by 1 every time you publish a paper. It's just obvious. There are evidence that people create citation circles. Listen, you're a postdoc of mine, you're not going to do your own research, make sure you always cite me, I always cite you. So you artificially increase it, whether the stuff is relevant or not. It's been shown that people have used this. You publish the same or very similar work in several places to increase the number of papers, the visibility, therefore your H factor may increase. even plagiarism of someone else's work just to get papers out, and frequently choosing low-quality journals and conferences to disseminate your work because it adds up to the bigger picture. You've published another paper. These things are all temporary. They don't last, because you can imagine it gets more and more difficult to increase your H factor the higher it gets. So if you publish a new paper and your H factor is 50, means that that new paper will have to get cited 51 times before it will increase the H factor. Okay, so it gets more and more difficult to get a big or a large H factor. What you can do to play the game, it's good to join the collaborations with big names and mature researchers, as people generally not work with you unless they value your research and your input either. So by working with these big names, it helps. You publish in well-known established journals, publish in open access, publish in a journal with an appropriate audience, because clearly if you publish where people read your work and they're interested in similar stuff, they'll also cite it. If you publish in a complete obscure journal, they'll never read it and they won't even know about it. Fortunately for the search engines nowadays, I think if your keywords are correct and your title is correct and your abstract is written very thoughtfully, then they will pick it up, because those obscure journals are also there, but it's not the right audience. Attend conferences and research meetings and talk to everyone so that they know who you are. While writing your paper, think about your readers and your search engines. This is very important because we know that certain words are keywords when people search, and they will then hit your work, they'll read it, and they'll cite it. This is interesting. You run a blog and present on social media. And for this instance, I just want to show you out of personal example what happened to us this week. We had a big media release about there's less than 500 white sharks left in southern Africa, and it was covered on CNN, Sky News, and BBC. My total number of citations or reads per week on ResearchGate is about 100 times. So people read about 100 of my papers every week. Last week, 1,111, and of these, about 1,020 was that shark paper. So I'm waiting to get cited on that shark paper for the right or the wrong reasons. But it works. It definitely works. There is a solution to this big problem as well, that people now say, well, we can't use the H factor because of all the problems. Let's use Altmetrics. It's just a modern way. This RG score that I just showed you, the ResearchGate score, is a metric that measures scientific reputation based on how all of your research is received by your peers. So it's how many times have you been on Facebook, Twitter, how many times, who's reading your work? Is it somebody that's important or somebody that's less important? All of that gives you a score, and you get an RG score of 38. And it tells you among the top 90% scientists in your field of research, based on your RG score, based on how people interact with your research. Read it, comment on it, cite it. Then there's also this crowdometer. These are only two examples. There are many of these Altmetrics. I'm sure people who work with this can add. This is, for example, specifically how many tweets. It says that up to 30% of all researchers use Twitter. So I'm behind. I'm not one of them. But I know going to conferences, people would come back and say, hey, we saw on Twitter you gave a talk about this. Well done. I said, well, because you're only allowed to give 30 characters, or how many, 50 characters on tweet when you tweet, whatever you do. So you can only say a couple of things, but we know that the social media is very powerful, and to get your science into the social media, it's part of playing this game as well. I just want to quickly touch on the impact factor of journals, which is another form of measuring quality of research. And I think it is important because sometimes the scientists would publish a paper in Nature, and the impact factor of the journal is 37. They say, that's the best paper published by anyone at the university ever, because it published it in the journal that's got a high impact factor. And clearly that's not the case. Okay, but it is used as a proxy for the relative importance of a journal. Out of personal experience, what I've seen, if you publish in a high impact factor journal, nearly always your number of citations is higher. And fortunately enough, I had a postdoc and we both did lobster projects. We used the same methodology, but we used different species. The paper that I'm the first author on, we published in an international journal, and the one that was where she's the first author on was in a local journal. And the impact factor between those two journals differ by 2.2 or 1. And the number of citations for the international paper is much higher than the other one. So I see a correlation. There is a correlation. So go for the highest impact possible, but it's got similar flaws. This was already mentioned by Garfield in 1955, the first time, talking about this. It's the average number of times articles from a journal published in the past 2 years get cited in the present year. So if you cite a journal, if a journal publishes 100 papers and they obtain 100 citations in the previous 2 years for all other papers published in that journal, the impact factor is 1. It's 100 divided by 100. If they get cited 50 times, and they publish 100 papers, 50 times in 2 years, they publish 100 papers, the impact factor is 0.5. Okay? So there's a range. You compare journals, you can pick in your field. This is the general sciences. You can see that the impact factor is median number of citations, the 2011 impact factor. If you cite them, you can see Nature, Lancet, Science, Cell, Nature, Genetics, all up here with impact factors close to 40, and then you can see PLOS ONE right there at 4. Okay? And we know PLOS ONE, my opinion on PLOS ONE is the high impact factors just simply because of the bulk of volume that they publish. You publish a huge number of papers. Some of them ought to be good, and they get cited a lot. But a lot of their papers are not cited a lot, and frankly are not that good either in my field. Okay? So you need to be careful also sometimes just to read too much in this impact factor story. There's just the rankings that you can do, but it says the same than the previous one. So the good of the impact factor is the sole advantage. It helps you to compare journals of the same field, and it gives you an idea of the journal's relative importance and reputation. I wouldn't bother too much whether the journal impact factor is 4 or 3.8. I think that's just splitting hairs. But certainly if the impact factor is 12 versus 2, there is a difference. And I bet you go through the review process and you'll see it. A journal with the impact factor of 12, you get the paper back 5 times, and then the editor still comments after that. A journal with the impact factor of 2, accept without 2 changes. Just make 2 changes and it's accepted. Please send it back in 10 days. There's a difference, okay, if you send the same paper to different people as well. It can be inappropriately used. We need to remember that the paper that you publish in that journal does not represent the impact factor of that journal. So you always need to go back and see how many times have your paper been cited being in that high impact factor journal. That gives a relative importance as to your paper. When calculating these impact factors by journals, the number of times the journals are self-cited, and I promise you I've had two editors asking me to please add an additional paper published in our journal to your reference list, if at all possible. We know we can't force you, but can you please see if you can't do it, because the impact factor is important. And the editors do it. They ask you to actually do that. Or they will add something and say, have you seen this paper? I think you should cite it. Okay? Journals that publish review papers are generally highly cited because reviews get cited more than general papers. Some journals don't publish reviews, so they will automatically have a lower impact factor. And then the impact factor depends on the size of the field concerned. Again, PLOS ONE published everywhere, in every field. So the impact factor is artificially increased, in my case, for what I do. So the take-home message, want to end up with what Alex Bateman said. It would be negligent to only look at the H index or the impact factor of a journal. And so I use a range of other metrics as well, together with good old-fashioned scientific judgment of the contributions from reading the application and papers. So often you have to go and read the papers and see what it means. So the take-home message I want to give is, yes, it is a valid measure. It is used, but somebody with an H index of 10 and somebody with an H index of 5 means absolutely nothing if you don't know where that's coming from and how it's calculated. Okay. That's all I have to say.
Okay, we'd just like to say thank you to Mattia for very interesting speaking. Thank you.
It's been, yeah, okay.
I'm the lead tourism from the library. I thought it's general practice if you, that with your H index, you always use the version that doesn't include self-citation.
If you're clever, that's what you do. But I mean, I don't think if people put their H index, if you apply for NRF rating, they want you to give both, and they specifically say that. Please indicate to us your H factor and your H factor excluding self-citations. It is a problem in a field where somebody is working in a very specialized area, and you start. Like I've recently started working on parasite phylogeography, and there's very little published on that. So the only work that you can really refer to is your own work, because nothing else has been done in South Africa, in the world for that matter. We're working in an area where it's us, and if it's not me, it's my wife. So we always cite the Matthias. And it's not because we want to, it's because that's the way our science developed. But certainly in other fields where there's many more, we try and not do it, but we're forced to. And I think in that sense, there are also reasons why people self-cite. And I think that's why the NRF wants both. And generally your A-rated scientists, who are these focused, specialized people in one field, they've got a lot of self-citations, and I check them up. It's the way it is.
There's no more questions.
Is that it?
Yes, thank you very much for
Okay.
taking our time.
Well, thank you. That's
Hope
very
you
kind of
enjoy.
you.
Yes, homebrewed.
Home brewed, okay. So I leave, can I just pull the plug?
Let me just quickly take a copy.
Okay.